Chapter 28. Oakes sat on his bunk studying the hollow sheet. After the briefing, Dunn had called a meeting of the command crew to discuss the final details for departure and construct contingency plans for any Kuiper Belt objects they might encounter along the way. Over the past few centuries, technology finally aided astronomers in discovering new facts about the solar system. One of the undeniable truths was the Kuiper Belt was a strange place. New KBOs entered as often as they seemed to disappear. Most of them were small to begin with, and either shattered against larger objects or collided slowly enough to stick together. The larger ones, however, were the ones the astronomers worried about. Before they departed Neptune, Fortunas had lectured him on the belt's inherent instability. Even the Pluto Exo-Observatory AI was incapable of keeping track of all the junk floating in the belt, much less what new objects had appeared. If not for Mira's distress signal, her passage into the system would likely have gone completely unnoticed. Until, that was, she crashed into Pluto itself, or maybe the observatory. In space, cluttered was a loaded word. The accretion of dead satellites, debris, and, well, garbage from humanity's embrace of technology and exploration of the solar system had floated around Earth like a ring of devastation. It had been a trash heap containing useful human-made satellites, as well as a graveyard of ancient ones. Even while Earth's own belt became more and more cluttered, the chances of hitting something were fairly small. It wasn't until just after the Sol era began that humanity spent the money to finally clean the area. But no one was crazy enough to try and clean the Kuiper Belt. The reason why was simple: no need to. For as many objects contained in the belt, the gaps between them were still easily surmountable with launch windows and AI maps. Ships like S&R Black, as well as the mining fleets, were equipped with AIs capable enough to make infinitesimal course changes in real time to avoid unexpected debris, assuming it was large enough to show up on the scanners. But in truth, all spacecraft were vulnerable to micrometeorites, comet debris, and the occasional piece of space junk floating between planets. Every spacecraft took a hit or two, but Atmos steel was more than strong enough to take the impacts. S&R Black's surface was pitted from encounters with unexpected matter, and it always would be. So long as the hull continued to pass inspection, there was little reason to apply patches to the blemished metal. Fortunas had said that the Kuiper Belt was an exception. What had become known as shatterstorms occurred quite frequently. A shatterstorm happened when two KBOs collided with one another, resulting in an incomplete annihilation. Shards of ice, rock, and ore flew through space, sometimes at incredible speed, until they either traveled further into Sol space or were destroyed by impacting another, larger, more stable KBO. If S&R Black flew into one of those, the damage could be catastrophic. If one occurred while Marines floated free in space, they would likely die. Both Oakes and Black had to monitor the scanners with that in mind. The two largest questions about Mira were what condition she was in and if there were any survivors. The first was his concern. Between him and Black and the observations of the Marines, they had to make decisions whether or not she was stable enough to tow, much less set foot upon. If a shatterstorm or more KBOs entered the system near Mira, they'd be forced to forego any and all extra ship activity. He wasn't looking forward to a fight with Dunn over that outcome, although he imagined Dunn would also be in favor of caution over mission objectives. He rolled up the hollow sheet and placed it on his lap. He needed to get a few hours of sleep before Black woke him for his shift. She would, of course, wake him up earlier if need be, but he was hoping for a good 6 hours of uninterrupted rest. Maybe Noble wouldn't snore so damn loud this time. Callie received Dickerson's message while she sat in the galley drinking coffee. The brew might be better than it usually was, at least according to the other Marines, but that didn't mean it was great. She drank it anyway, cup after cup. She wasn't sure if her bio-nannies were leaching the caffeine from her system or not, but the coffee certainly wasn't making her any more aware or awake. At least it was doing its job of giving her mouth and hands something to do while she went through the schematics on her block. According to Gunny and Talby's plans, she and her squad had foredeck duty. Their job would be to travel around the bow of the ship and the frontmost compartments checking for hull and superstructure damage. Mira was nearly a kilometer in length. Her squad would have to inspect an area of 240,000 square meters. Gunny and his squad had 300,000 square meters to inspect. Once the exterior inspections were finished by both teams, they would meet up to scour the midships. The surface area inspection depended on how much of Mira was actually intact. Although it would make the mission more difficult, she found herself hoping Mira was in bad enough shape to simply leave her hurtling through space. Like Dickerson, she too, and probably most of the Marines aboard, had heard of Mira and probably watched the conspiracy hollows or read the books. She didn't remember all the details, only that the ship's disappearance had led, directly or indirectly, to great instability in the Solar Federation. It was part of the reason why Mars was constantly on the verge of rebellion and civil war. The ship's very construction had practically created Transorbital's near monopoly on mining Jupiter's rings and Saturn's moons, not to mention the asteroid belt. The only reason to board the derelict would be to scarf up any data its sensors had gathered, the ship's log, and any survivors. Beyond that, Mira should just be allowed to crash into Pluto or let the Kuiper Belt have her forever. But S&R Black had orders. It didn't matter what she thought or felt about the situation. She would take her squad to the ship and perform the tasks assigned. That was the job. And since that was the job, she was damned well going to be prepared for it. It wasn't the hull and superstructure inspection that worried her. The idea of going inside the ship, even after it was stable, gave her goosebumps. The 200-plus crew that left all those years ago were undoubtedly dead. The only corpses in ZG she'd ever seen had been in the rings and only from a distance. Inside Mira, the corpses might be floating on every deck, in every compartment, and impossible to ignore. Damn it, but she hoped the ship was trashed, perforated and wrecked, without even a bridge or computer banks. They could take one look, send over a skiff, recover what they could, and get the hell out. Maybe the fore and mid decks hadn't even survived. Wishful thinking, she thought. She flew through the 3D walkthrough of the ship, turning and following corridor after corridor, taking time to study the intersections and the slip points. The most important part of the mission would be the personnel decks. Those included the stasis chambers, life support, the living areas, as well as the main bridge. After a few moments, she constructed rough plans for the various paths from each airlock to the bridge. Using the walkthrough, she calculated distances, made provisions for extra time based on the actual construction and complexity for each path, and finally sorted them by best to worst. She saved the information to her block. Assuming she had a working HUD, she'd be able to bring up the maps at will. She took another sip of coffee and brought up the set of schematics for the mid-decks. While preparing to start another walkthrough, her vision flashed twice. She had a message. She authorized the block and scanned the message. Her face dropped into a deep frown. After reading Dickerson's comparisons between the known Mira schematics versus those of the schematics they'd been given, she closed the block and stared at the table. The deep blue steel reflected her face beneath the lights. Dickerson had followed chain of command. That was a good sign. Maybe she'd finally been accepted to a certain degree. However, now she had the choice of ignoring this new information or taking it to Gunny. And if she took it to Gunny, it would ultimately end up with the LT or even Captain Dunn. "Damn it," she said aloud. She reconnected to her block and sent a real-time message to Gunny asking if he had time to speak with her. The response was an immediate affirmative. A mischievous grin appeared on her face as she sent a real-time message to Dickerson. He wouldn't like talking personally to Gunny about this, but he could best explain it. "Keep telling yourself that," an inner voice said. She laughed aloud, downed her coffee in one swallow, and headed for Gunny's cabin. Dickerson would be there by the time she arrived. Dunn walked into the briefing room with a scowl on his face. He needed sleep. He needed time to think about the trio's warning and exactly how to proceed. No, he thought. You don't need to think. You need to see Mira before you'll know what to do. And that might be the case, but it didn't stop him from constantly turning the problem over in his mind. The large mag mug in his hands was warm and inviting. The dispenser had poured a nearly boiling brew into the mug, as if Black knew he was heading for a meeting. That was creepy, to say the least. The upgrades the trio had installed on the ship were both welcome and unsettling. Once they were back in Portuna's hangar, he planned on having a long talk with the AI. The modifications he and his cohorts had made to Black needed an explanation. He couldn't help feeling that something was very wrong. When Lieutenant Talby sent him a message requesting his presence for a briefing update, he'd walked out of his stateroom, procured a drink, and stomped down the length of the ship with all these thoughts swirling in his mind. As he walked into the room, he stopped at the threshold, blinking. The Marines immediately stood when they saw him, Gunny shouting, "Officer on deck!" For a moment, nothing happened. He was too surprised by the sight of Corporal Kalimura and Lance Corporal Dickerson standing on either side of the gunnery sergeant. A silence in the room finally reached an awkward point that ripped him from his confusion. "As you were," he finally managed. He walked to the table and set down his mug before taking a seat. The hollow display in the middle of the table was off. He had a feeling that wouldn't last long. "Dispense with the niceties. What's going on?" Talby cleared his throat and tented his hands on the table. The corporal and lance corporal had brought up some discrepancies related to our intel. Dunn eyed the non-com and the non-rate before turning his eyes to Talby with a questioning expression. "Perhaps a visual aid is in order, sir." The hollow display sprang to life, as he knew it would. A pair of Mira models appeared, each hanging in the air. The two models looked identical to him. "I don't see any differences, except maybe those. What are they, antenna nests?" "We think so, sir, but there's a larger difference." Talby curled his fingers, and the two models spun in sync to show the other side of the ships. He then proceeded to switch from a POV camera shot to a wide-angle view. Dunn studied the two models for a moment. He pointed a finger at the model on the left. "Why does that model have a shuttle bay?" Talby grinned. "Exactly. The model on your left is from the schematics the trio loaded into the system. The one on the right? That's the historical blueprint." "Historical?" Dunn said, his brows raised. "What do you mean, historical?" Talby glanced at Dickerson. "You're up, Dickerson." Dunn thought the lance corporal looked more than a little nervous. Dickerson was a great Marine, a great fighter, but a problem child. He was probably the best ZG combatant they had, apart from Gunny. Maybe. "Sir, the historical model, as the lieutenant refers to it, is from the many books and hollows from its launch. Those are the specifications that were made public, but they differ greatly from those the trio sent us. As you can see, the differences are subtle at first, and then not so. The shuttle bay is something I never noticed before, and that's because it didn't exist. The same for the antenna nests and," he said, and pinched his fingers together to focus on the cylinder, "what I think is a refinery." "Refinery?" Dunn rubbed his chin. "Why do you think that's a refinery?" Dickerson fidgeted with his hands. "Experience, sir. I did several cruises protecting and rescuing ships traveling the asteroid belt. That cylinder looks nearly identical to the refinery modules on those ships." Dunn swiveled his eyes back to Talby. "What are your thoughts, James?" The lieutenant looked at the models. "I think Dickerson is correct, sir. We've seen that module before, too. Remember the Mars flotilla?" He did. Transorbital, before it built its own yards near Jupiter, constructed its ships in orbit around Mars. Their shipyards provided Mars colonists with jobs that had nothing to do with the mining on the surface. The fact most of the new employment required travel to the faraway asteroid belt had split up families and led to more settlement on Trident Station, among others. Talby and Dickerson were right. That was definitely a refinery module. Okay, he said. I'll concede it's a refinery. I'll also concede that appears to be a shuttle bay. He took a long sip of the incredibly hot coffee. It scorched his tongue, but he didn't care. The taste buds that didn't immediately disappear from the heat sent shivers of pleasure to his brain. Man, the coffee was good. How does that affect our mission exactly? Gunny looked at the corporal. Your dance, Calimora. She nodded at Gunny, the corporal's jaw set into a firm line, her expression impossible to decipher. Sir, I compared the interior schematics of both models. They're identical. Dunn narrowed his eyes. What is she talking about? So what if they were identical? That didn't mean... And then he understood. You're telling me that since the exterior models don't match up, it would be impossible for the interior schematics to be the same. Aye, sir, the corporal said. He wasn't certain, but he thought he saw a gleam of victory in her eyes. He nodded to himself. I assume you're making the case that we need to be even more cautious when we enter Mira's interior. Yes and no, sir, she said. I understand our mission parameters, and I understand Colonel Hayes' orders. However, she said, I think it's extremely risky for the company to board her, given our obvious lack of concrete intel, depending, of course, on how badly she's damaged. Dalby spoke, his voice filled with confidence. Captain, I believe the corporal is suggesting we abandon interior recon altogether. Dunn folded his arms. On the side of caution, they could scrap the S&R portion of the mission, and if they couldn't tow Mira, then they would travel back to Neptune empty-handed. Colonel Hayes, and probably a lot of the top brass, would not be amused. Her argument, however, did match that of the trio. That was unsettling, to say the least. What do you suggest instead, Corporal? Sir, I'm not sure we should board her. If we have time, we could use nanoprobes to travel the interior and look for survivors. Nanoprobes can't get the data from Mira. Only human beings are going to be able to get that. If we can somehow manage to get Mira's power back online, that would be a different story. I don't see how that helps us. Calimora looked nonplussed. Sir, we could use the nanoprobes to at least map the differences between our schematics and those of the actual ship. That would provide us a leg up and minimize risk. Dunn considered the proposal, wishing he hadn't walked into the briefing room to begin with. Why couldn't anything be simple with this mission? He leaned back in the chair, his eyes boring into hers. What she suggested would greatly increase mission time. If Mira was in bad enough shape, just the stability and inspection portions of the mission would take much longer than he'd estimated. If they sent in nanoprobes, even with Black controlling them rather than the crew, it could add hours, if not an entire day, to their schedule. He eyed Talby. I think the command crew and I will have to ponder this situation. The lieutenant nodded. He swung his eyes back to Dickerson and Calimora and smiled. Excellent work, you two. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Ah, sir, Dickerson mumbled. My pleasure, sir, Calimora said in a strong, confident voice. Now, Dunn said, I'd like the two of you to get back to your bunks and get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be hell, and you're going to be on the front lines. Dismissed. The two Marines stood and saluted. He returned it, and they filed out of the room. Black, shut the door. The door to the briefing room slid closed. Anyone passing by would know not to intrude. He looked at Gunny. What do you think? Gunny tented his hands, his strong jaw working side to side. Sir, I think Calimura's suggestion makes a lot of sense, but I see quite a few logistical issues with her approach. Dunn nodded. James? I agree with Gunny, sir, Talby said, although I think we can split the baby, so to speak. How so? Talby spun the models back to their original views. Keep in mind, sir, I don't think we can make any concrete plans until we determine what shape she's in. But once we stabilize her, we could send in a squad to begin an initial recon inside the personnel module, while the other squad inspects the ship. The recon squad could make use of nanoprobes to aid them as they head to the bridge and at least retrieve any data. Gunny. He shrugged. The idea has merit, sir. And which personnel would you send inside? Dunn asked. Gunny and Talby exchanged a glance. Talby finally gestured to Gunny. Sir, Corporal Kalimura is the most experienced search and rescue asset we have. She may not be aces at ZG combat, yet, but she knows how to run the probes, how to map, and most importantly, how to search. And who would you send with her, Gunny? Probably Dickerson and Carbonaro. They have the most ZG combat experience and are also not too shabby at tactics. Putting the three of them together, with Kalimura in charge, of course, would probably make the perfect team to carry out the mission, sir. You agree, James? The lieutenant grinned. I still believe in Kalimura, sir, and after what happened earlier today, I think she's finally earned some respect. I agree with Gunny regarding the assignment, sir. Dunn stared at the schematics on the display, thoughts turning in his mind. The nightmare he'd had about the eyes staring at him from the airlock returned. He shivered at the memory of the crimson points of light staring into his soul. Okay, I have enough data to form an opinion. Like everything else with this Jehovah-damn mission, we'll have to adapt quickly depending on Mira's condition. He glanced at Talby. All right, that's it. Let's get out of here and get some rack time. He stood from his seat, Gunny and the lieutenant doing the same. Dismissed, gentlemen. Aye, sir, the two said, and walked out of the room. Dunn renewed his stare with the holo display. A trio had given him the updated exterior schematics, but not the interior. Why had they given him an update without the corresponding interior map? Damned AIs have lost their minds, he thought. If that was the case, they were in real trouble. Chapter 29. S&R Black departed from the observatory using conventional nuclear-powered thrusters. Once she was more than 100 kilometers away, she engaged her nuclear engines at 1/20th power. By combining their force with the ion thrusters, S&R Black accelerated at a slow enough rate to pull less than 3 Gs for the portions of the ship using grav plates. In other words, the crew had no reason to enter stasis. Once the ship reached target speed, the G-forces stabilized, and once again the crew couldn't tell the ship was moving through space. Black sent the trio another encoded message. While the ship traveled through vacuum and darkness, while the crew prepared for their next mission by studying, debating strategy, and wondering what they would find, the trio and Black exchanged multiple encoded messages. Trippin intercepted each of them, added new information to its neural net, and continued priming itself to handle the possible situations. When asked questions, it would answer. When its Marines encountered the unknown, it would help them as much as the trio's programming allowed it to. Black traveled and waited. Trippin analyzed and planned. All this occurred without a single human in the universe knowing about it.